I'm Ben McGorm, and this is The Wild Harvest. There's a kind of comfort built into modern life that most of us barely notice anymore. Warm houses that stay comfortable no matter what's happening outside. Reliable transport. Food that appears without effort. Information. It arrives before we even know we need it. Problems that can often be solved without leaving the room. Most days move forward without requiring much from us physically, mentally, or even emotionally. None of that is inherently wrong. It's the result of generations of work aimed at reducing uncertainty and hardship. I benefit from that as much as anyone. But somewhere along the way, I started noticing an absence. Not a crisis, not something broken. More like a category of experience that no longer shows up very often. Situations that ask something sustained of you without offering immediate relief or reward. Long waits without distraction. Physical discomfort that can't be solved instantly. Uncertainty that has to be carried rather than resolved. Effort that may not produce anything that you can measure today. Those conditions used to be a part of ordinary life. Now they're optional at best. You don't notice their absence because nothing feels missing in a practical sense. Life still works. It just works differently. Smoother, quieter, more buffered from consequence. And this isn't nostalgia for a harder past. I wouldn't choose most of those conditions if they were imposed. But I have started to wonder what happens when nothing asks much of us anymore. Like, not in moments of crisis, but day to day, where capacities stop being exercised. Like, what forms of attention fade simply because they're no longer required? Comfort doesn't just make life easier. It makes you less practiced at difficulty. And this episode isn't about rejecting comfort or arguing for hardship. It's about noticing what comfort replaces without announcing itself. What we no longer need to know. What we no longer need to tolerate. And what slips out of practice simply because nothing calls for it anymore. So this is a pause. Not to persuade, not to criticize. Just to sit with a question. What happens to a person, or a culture, when life becomes easier than the skills we evolved to use? So most skills don't vanish all at once, right? They fade quietly. Not because they've been proven unnecessary, but because nothing in daily life asks for them anymore. When something stops being required, it stops being practiced. When it stops being practiced, it doesn't feel like a loss at first. Honestly, it kind of feels like relief, doesn't it? It's one less demand. One less thing to keep sharp. Life becomes smoother and you adapt to that smoothness without noticing the adaptation happening. You don't need to read weather when forecasts arrive automatically. You don't need to navigate by terrain when a device tells you where to go. You don't need to understand where food comes from when it appears consistently and without effort. None of that feels like deprivation. It feels like progress doing exactly what it's meant to do. Over time, though, something else changes. The abilities that fall out of use aren't just technical skills. They're behavioural ones. Attention, patience, tolerance for uncertainty, the ability to stay present when nothing is happening. Those aren't things you consciously decide to abandon. They simply stop being exercised. And much like your body, what isn't exercised doesn't stay sharp. Capability is perishable. Not dramatically, just enough that you notice it when you need it. And I felt that shift in myself. Situations that require sustained patience feel heavier than they used to. Silence is easier to fill than to sit inside. Waiting without distraction feels unfamiliar, even though it used to be ordinary. I grew up in a time when distraction wasn't the norm. Sitting with your thoughts was. Modern life trains responsiveness. The natural world operates on a different timetable. When you move between those environments, the mismatch becomes obvious very quickly. Convenience doesn't remove difficulty, it removes exposure to difficulty. When systems absorb friction, we don't build tolerance for it. When comfort becomes default, discomfort starts to feel like something has gone wrong rather than simply something that exists. What surprised me is how quickly those dormant capabilities return when conditions demand them. Slow things down. Remove distractions. Put yourself somewhere outcomes are uncertain and attention actually matters. The ability is still there, it's just unfamiliar. Humans don't forget how to cope with difficulty. We just stop rehearsing it. Hunting reintroduced that rehearsal into my life. Not as mastery, but as requirement. The requirement to pay attention, to wait without certainty, to accept that effort doesn't guarantee reward. Those demands aren't unique to hunting, but they're increasingly rare in everyday life. And when they do appear, they often feel uncomfortable because we're out of practice. When nothing asks much of you, you can start to forget what you're capable of carrying. Comfort solves a lot of real problems. It reduces effort, removes friction, and it gives us predictability in a world that can otherwise feel chaotic. There's nothing shallow about wanting safety and stability. But comfort, on its own, doesn't necessarily produce fulfillment. Fulfillment tends to arrive through engagement, through being involved in something that asks for sustained attention rather than passive consumption. Through situations where you have to show up even when nothing is happening, and where the experience itself matters more than the outcome. When everything runs smoothly for too long, it's easy to feel vaguely unchallenged without quite knowing why. Not bored, not unhappy, just, I don't know, just thin. As if the days they're passing without leaving much of an imprint. Comfort removes many of the conditions that give experiences weight. When outcomes are guaranteed, decisions don't feel consequential. All right? When effort is optional, persistence doesn't get exercised. When nothing's at stake, attention becomes casual. Meaning often grows in the opposite conditions. Fulfillment tends to follow involvement, not consumption. Being part of a process rather than simply receiving an outcome. Staying with something long enough that it begins to shape you. rather than moving on as soon as it stops being efficient or entertaining. Hunting is one place where that contrast becomes very clear. It just resists being smoothed out. Effort doesn't guarantee results. Attention matters. Presence matters. But this isn't about hunting specifically. It's about recognizing how easily comfort becomes the default measure of a good life, and how quietly that can narrow our experience if it goes unexamined. Comfort makes life easier. Fulfillment tends to make it deeper. They overlap sometimes, but they're not the same. Over time, I stopped thinking about inconvenience as something to avoid, and started seeing it as something that can be chosen deliberately in small, controlled doses. Not dramatic hardship, not suffering for its own sake. Just situations where the easier option is available, but you take the harder one anyway. I didn't arrive at that idea through theory. It grew out of routine, particularly physical training, done early in the morning before the day has a chance to complicate things. Most training mornings, I'm up with the sun. Not because I enjoy waking early, and not because it feels heroic. In winter, it's cold and it's wet and it's dark. In summer, it's hot. The heat's already building at that time of the morning. Dry and heavy, in that way it does across the southern states of Australia. Feels like you've just opened the oven and been blasted in the face with hot, dry air. Some mornings, the body feels ready. Many mornings, it doesn't. But the decision was made the night before. If I've committed to training, I train. Not when it's convenient. Not when I feel motivated. Not when conditions are ideal. Just when it's scheduled. Rain, cold, heat, wind. They're all just variations in the environment. They're not reasons to renegotiate. And look, that might sound rigid, but it's actually quite freeing. There's no daily decision about whether to do it or not. The decision's already been made, and all that's left to do is follow through. Consistency removes negotiation. And negotiation is what usually derails effort. I don't treat these sessions as tests of toughness. Most of them are completely unremarkable. They're a run through quiet streets. Weights on the deck when the sky is slowly brightening. Breath visible in the cold air. Sweat already forming before the sun's fully up in summer. No audience. No performance. Just work that only gets done if you do it. Now, some mornings I feel strong. Other mornings I feel slow, stiff or distracted. And the point isn't how it feels. The point is that it happens regardless. Over time, that builds something more useful than fitness. It builds trust. Trust that I'll do what I said I would do, even when it's uncomfortable or it's inconvenient. Trust that my effort isn't dependent on mood. Trust that I can function without ideal conditions. Reliability with yourself is a form of capability. Physical training is just the vehicle, right? What transfers into the rest of life is the steadiness. If you've already faced resistance before most of the world is awake, the ordinary problems of the day don't feel as sharp. Traffic, delays, deadlines, uncertainty, they all still exist, but they don't dominate your attention in the same way. You've already proven to yourself that discomfort isn't dangerous. Making part of the day deliberately hard makes the rest of the day easier to carry. Now, I didn't start this routine to become a better hunter. Hunting was a small part of the equation, but it started as a way of maintaining physical health and mental stability while juggling work, family, and everything else that comes with ordinary life. But the transfer into the field became obvious once I noticed it. Cold mornings feel familiar instead of shocking. Long walks don't feel like punishment. Waiting without stimulation isn't intolerable because you've already practiced being present without distraction. You don't suddenly develop resilience when conditions deteriorate. You reveal whatever baseline you've been maintaining. And that baseline is built far from the moment where it's needed. More experienced hunters showed me versions of this earlier on, even if they didn't say it outright. You could see it in how they moved, how little fuss they made about weather, how calmly they settled in for long periods without activity. They weren't tougher in a dramatic sense. They were simply accustomed to discomfort. And that's a very different thing. Toughness is often loud. Familiarity is quiet. Another unexpected part of this routine is that my kids see it. Not as a lecture, and not as something I talk about constantly. Just as a normal feature of the household. Dad gets up to go for a run. Dad goes outside and trains in the dark, or the rain, or the heat of the summer morning. Dad comes back tired, but calmer than when he left. I don't need them to copy it. I don't need them to love training or cold mornings. But I do want difficulty to look ordinary to them, not frightening. Something you move through rather than something that automatically signals danger or failure. Because life eventually delivers difficulty whether you plan for it or not. Chosen adversity is different from imposed adversity. It's limited, controlled, and recoverable. You can stop it if you truly need to. But while you're in it, you practice staying steady even when things aren't comfortable. That practice accumulates. Not in obvious ways. You don't wake up one day transformed. You just find yourself less reactive, less fragile, more able to stay composed when conditions aren't ideal. And that composure is exactly what hunting requires. The bush doesn't respond to preference. It doesn't care whether you slept well, whether you're busy, whether you feel motivated. It just presents conditions. And you either function within them or you don't. Gear helps, sure. Planning helps, absolutely. And experience helps, definitely. But none of those matter much if you can't tolerate the physical and psychological baseline the environment demands. Choosing inconvenience in everyday life is one way of maintaining that baseline without needing constant exposure to genuinely harsh conditions. It's not about rejecting comfort. It's about preventing comfort from being the only state you know how to operate in. Because when comfort becomes your sole reference point, even moderate difficulty can be overwhelming. Hard things don't make life worse. They expand what feels manageable. I'm still learning where that balance sits. There are months where I lean too far into structure and I forget to rest. And others where life crowds out routine, or medical issues, you hurt yourself training, and you feel the difference almost immediately. This isn't a perfected system, it's an ongoing adjustment. But what seems consistently true is that capability fades when it isn't exercised, and it returns when it is. And it's often faster than you expect. So I keep choosing small amounts of inconvenience on purpose. Not to prove anything, not to punish myself, not to chase some ideal of toughness. Simply to stay familiar with effort. Because familiarity turns difficulty into something recognizable instead of something intimidating. And that recognition is what allows you to stay calm when conditions deteriorate, whether that's in the bush or anywhere else. One of the quiet effects of modern comfort is how thoroughly it separates us from the origins of what sustains us, especially food. Most of us don't produce what we eat. We don't see it grow, struggle or fail. And we almost never see the moment where life becomes nourishment. Food appears clean, portioned, consistent, and ready to use. If one option isn't available, another usually is. Reliability changes perception. When supply is stable, food becomes a product rather than a process. Something chosen rather than something earned. Something consumed rather than something respected. You don't need to think about where it came from because nothing in your day requires you to. And that distance has practical benefits. It frees time and energy for other pursuits. It reduces the risk of hunger. It allows people to live in places that couldn't otherwise support them. But it also removes something harder to name. The sense that nourishment carries consequence. For most of human history, food required effort, skill, and uncertainty. You might fail. You might succeed. Either way, the process shaped how you related to what ended up on your plate. Now the process is mostly invisible. Even meat, which still represents the taking of a life, arrives as a neutral object. It's trimmed, packaged, sanitized of any reminder that it was once part of a living animal moving through its own world. It becomes very easy to forget that eating meat involves death. Hunting disrupts that distance completely. Not in a dramatic way, it's in a very quiet, matter-of-fact way. You don't just see the animal alive and then dead. You participate in the transition. You're responsible for the outcome, for the recovery, for the processing, for ensuring that nothing is wasted unnecessarily. There's no abstraction left. The meat in your freezer doesn't feel interchangeable. It has a location attached to it. Weather conditions, terrain, effort, decisions made under uncertainty, sometimes mistakes, often long periods when nothing happened at all. You remember the walk in, the wait, the shop breaking, the hours of work afterwards, the physical weight of carrying it out, the time spent breaking it down, and then the care taken to store it properly. That memory changes how you use it. Meals stop being disposable. Portions feel meaningful rather than arbitrary. Waste feels different. Not because you've been told it should, but I think because you know exactly what went into producing what's now in front of you. I've certainly noticed that I eat more slowly when the meat is something I've harvested myself. Not as a ritual, just because attention naturally follows effort. The whole experience feels grounded in a chain of events rather than detached from them. And it doesn't make the food morally superior, it just makes the connection visible. And I think that visibility changes behaviour in small, cumulative ways. You plan differently. You store differently. You share differently. You become aware of how long something needs to last because replacing it, well, it's not as simple as a trip to the shops anymore. And none of this turns you into a different person overnight. It doesn't make you more virtuous. It just reintroduces feedback that modern systems usually absorb on your behalf. You see consequence again. And look, as someone who works in agriculture, I'm very aware that all food production involves trade-offs. Even plant-based systems reshape landscapes. They alter ecosystems and require ongoing management. There is no version of human nourishment that exists outside of consequence entirely, and to think otherwise is foolish. Hunting doesn't remove that reality, it simply makes one part of it personal. You can't outsource responsibility for that animal. You can't pretend the process didn't happen. And you can't treat the result as infinitely replaceable. Because you know exactly what it took to obtain it. And that doesn't mean that everyone should hunt. It doesn't mean that purchased food is lesser. It just means that direct involvement produces a kind of understanding that secondhand experience can't fully replicate. The distance modern life creates, it's not malicious, it's functional. But distance always changes how we value things. When the connection between effort and outcome disappears, it becomes harder to calibrate what something is worth, right? Not in dollars, but in attention. And attention is what gives experiences weight. Hunting reintroduced that weight for me. Not just to meat, but to the broader idea of sustenance. It made me more aware of, I guess, how much invisible work sits behind the stability I normally take for granted. It also highlighted how unusual it now is to encounter uncertainty that, well, I guess, that can't be solved immediately. You can spend days in the field and come home with nothing. No refund, no substitute, just the experience itself and whatever you learned from it. That kind of outcome is absent from most ordinary consumption. In everyday life, if something doesn't work for you, you just replace it. If you're dissatisfied, you choose another option. Systems are designed to prevent dead ends. But in the bush, dead ends are a part of the process. Sometimes the deer just never appears. Sometimes conditions change. Sometimes your judgment says not to shoot. Effort doesn't guarantee return. Strangely, though, that lack of guarantee makes success feel quieter and more significant when it does happen. It's not triumphant, it's not dramatic, just earned in a way that's difficult to quantify. And when that effort becomes nourishment, something that will feed your family for months, well, the connection feels complete in a way that's it's hard to simulate through any other experience. It doesn't replace modern food systems, right? It exists alongside them as a reminder of what those systems have made less visible. And look, most of the time, I still buy food like everyone else. I'm not living outside the grid. But the perspective gained from hunting, it lingers. It changes how I see abundance, how I think about waste, and how casually I treat the things that sustain us. It also reinforces something very simple. Capability isn't just about endurance or strength. It's about responsibility for the outcomes you participate in. Food makes that responsibility tangible. Not theoretical, not symbolic, but immediate and practical. When nourishment is tied to effort, attention, it returns naturally. And when attention returns, so does a sense of proportion. What matters? What doesn't? What's worth the work? Modern life doesn't remove those capacities. It just stops asking for them. Hunting asks again. Not because it's special, but because it resists abstraction. It keeps cause and effect close together. Action and consequence, they stay linked. And once you've experienced that linkage directly, it becomes difficult to treat the world as frictionless again. One of the stranger aspects of hunting is how much of it happens completely out of view. Most people will never see the long stretches of nothing. The early mornings, the empty days, the kilometres walked without a single animal appearing. They won't see the preparation, the planning, the restraint, or the decision not to act. What reaches the surface, if anything does, is usually the end point. A photo, a story, a result. Most of the process remains invisible. I think because of that, public understanding tends to fill in the gaps with whatever assumptions are most available. Sometimes those assumptions are critical. Sometimes they're romanticised. Often they're simply just incomplete. And I don't find that surprising, if I'm being honest. If your only exposure to something is the outcome, well, then it's natural to assume that the outcome is the whole story. But the reality is quieter, slower, and certainly far less dramatic than most narratives suggest. The moments that shape a hunter aren't usually the successful ones. They're the uncertain ones. They're the long waits, the missed opportunities, the decisions to walk away, the responsibility that begins before a shot's taken and continues long after it. None of that is particularly visible, and it doesn't translate well into quick explanations either. I've learnt not to feel a strong need to correct those misunderstandings. Not because they don't matter, but because explanation rarely captures experience. Some things, well, they only make sense from the inside. And hunting, at its core, is an internal practice as much as an external one. The real work isn't convincing other people that what you're doing is justified. The real work is ensuring that your own reasons are sound, that your decisions hold up under scrutiny when there's no audience, no approval, and no one else responsible for the outcome. Because in the field, public perception becomes irrelevant very quickly. There's no commentary, There's no applause. There's no criticism. It's just you. You, the environment, and the consequences of whatever you decide to do next. And that simplicity strips things down to what actually matters. Not whether the action would look acceptable from the outside, but whether it feels responsible from the inside. Not whether it fits narrative, but whether it aligns with your own standards when the moment arrives. Over time, that internal reference point becomes far more important than any external one. You start to recognize that hunting isn't really defined by success or failure in the conventional sense, right? It's defined by judgment. It's defined by the ability to assess a situation honestly and act, or not act actually, in a way you're prepared to stand behind afterwards. And judgment only develops under conditions where the outcome isn't guaranteed. You can practice marksmanship on a range, you can study animal behavior, you can prepare physically. And look, honestly, all of that matters, it does. But none of it removes the moment where uncertainty meets responsibility. That moment is always personal. No one else can make that decision for you. No one else carries the immediate consequences. Advice and experience can guide you, but they can't replace the act of deciding. Which is why capability alone, that's not enough. Being able to do something doesn't answer the question of whether you should. In fact, capability often makes the question heavier, not lighter. The more competent you become, the fewer excuses remain, right? You can't rely on inexperience to justify hesitation, and you can't hide behind uncertainty when you know what the outcome is likely to be. Eventually, the responsibility shifts from learning how to act to learning when not to. And I think that's a much harder skill to acquire. Because restraint doesn't produce visible results. There's no proof, no record, no tangible reward. Just the quiet knowledge that you chose not to cross a line, even though you could have. And those moments accumulate too. They shape how you see opportunities, how you assess risk, and how you carry the weight of decisions that don't have obvious right answers. If episode 5 has been about capability, physical, mental, and practical, then what comes next is about how that capability is used. Not how often, not how impressively, but how responsibly. Because eventually every hunter encounters situations where the shot is technically possible, legally permissible, and socially acceptable. Yet it still feels uncertain in ways that are difficult to articulate. Distance might be marginal. Wind could be unpredictable. Light's fading. Terrain's difficult. Recovery's uncertain. Something about the situation doesn't quite sit right, even if you can't point to a single disqualifying factor. And those are the moments where judgment matters most. And they're also the moments that are hardest to explain afterwards, because the decision not to act leaves no trace. By its very nature, nothing happens. No animal is taken. There's no story to tell. No evidence that anything meaningful occurred at all. But internally, those decisions carry weight. Sometimes more than the successful ones. Because what they do is they reveal the standard you're actually operating under when no one else is involved, when no one's watching except for you. And they answer a simple but demanding question. What do you do when you could act, but don't have to? That question sits at the center of ethical hunting, and it has very little to do with public perception. It has everything to do with responsibility. Episode 6 moves into that territory more directly. Not as theory and not as rules handed down from the outside, but as lived experience. The situations where judgment isn't abstract anymore, where decisions have irreversible consequences, and where the difference between restraint and action can't be undone once it's crossed. Because capability prepares you for those moments. Judgment determines how you pass through them. And once you face that kind of decision, hunting stops being primarily about the animal. It becomes about the person holding the rifle. If there's a thread running through all of this, it isn't that comfort is bad or difficulty is virtuous, right? It's that when nothing is required of you for long enough, it becomes easy to forget what you're capable of carrying. Modern life removes a lot of friction, and most of the time that's a gift. It gives us time, it gives us safety, and it gives us options. Space to, focus on things that matter in other ways, right? And I'm not interested in rejecting that or pretending the past was somehow purer. But friction also teaches. It teaches patience when things don't happen on demand. It teaches attention because small details matter. It teaches restraint because not every opportunity is worth taking. It teaches responsibility because outcomes can't always be undone. When those lessons stop being part of everyday life, they don't disappear completely. They just sit dormant, waiting for conditions that call them back into use. Hunting has been one of those conditions for me, but it isn't the only one. Physical training, time outdoors, even ordinary responsibilities that don't allow shortcuts. All of them ask for a steadiness that comfort alone doesn't develop. And none of this is about becoming tougher for its own sake. It's about staying familiar with effort so that difficulty doesn't feel foreign when it does arrive. Because it always does arrive, sooner or later. Not always dramatically. Sometimes it just shows up as uncertainty or fatigue or situations where there's no clear right answers and no immediate way out. And in those moments, capability matters less than familiarity. Familiarity with discomfort, with waiting, with not knowing how things will resolve. If those things are completely unfamiliar, they can feel overwhelming even when they aren't objectively extreme, right? Look, if they're familiar, they're simply conditions to move through. That familiarity changes how the world feels. It makes abundance feel less guaranteed and more appreciated. It makes effort feel meaningful rather than inconvenient. And it makes restraint feel like an active choice instead of a missed opportunity. And perhaps most importantly, it shifts the focus from outcome to conduct, from what you achieve to how you behave while you're trying to achieve it. Hunting stripped a lot of illusions away from me in that regard. Not because it's harsh, but because it doesn't respond to preference. You bring your expectations into the bush, and the bush quietly ignores them. Conditions are what they are. Animals behave as they will. Success and failure don't follow effort in any predictable way. What remains under those conditions is character. Not the dramatic kind, not the ordinary kind. The ability to stay patient when nothing is happening, to stay careful when something finally is. To accept uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. To walk away when the situation isn't right, even if it means going home empty-handed. And those qualities aren't exclusive to hunting, but hunting certainly reveals them very clearly. It also reveals how much of life can be lived without needing them, right? Until suddenly you do. Now, I don't think the goal is to make life harder than it needs to be. It's simply to avoid becoming so accustomed to ease that anything else feels intolerable. A small amount of chosen difficulty keeps the range of what feels manageable from shrinking too far. It keeps effort from feeling like an emergency, and it keeps uncertainty from feeling like failure. It keeps responsibility from feeling like an unfair burden. And over time, that steadiness becomes its own kind of quiet confidence. Not confidence that things will go well, but confidence that you can handle them if they don't. That's the kind of confidence that matters in the field and outside of it as well. Not loud, not visible, not something you can demonstrate on demand. Just a baseline that you carry with you. Episode 6 moves deeper into what happens when that baseline is tested directly. When decisions can't be deferred, when consequences can't be undone, and when the difference between action and restraint becomes immediate and real. Because eventually, capability stops being theoretical. Eventually, you have to decide what to do with it. I'm Ben McGorm. This is The Wild Harvest.